Good evening. I'm Jeff Badnock, and on behalf of the University of Montana Alumni Association and the Community Lecture Series Committee, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the third lecture of the 2022 University of Montana Alumni Association Annual Community Lecture Series. This series was established more than 20 years ago as a means to give a spotlight to the many amazing faculty at work researching and lecturing on the university's campuses. The series shares with the community the cutting-edge work in the arts and sciences for which the university is so well known. Like last year, we are mindful of your health and are hosting this year's lectures online via Zoom and Facebook. We all hope that next year's lectures will be before a live audience. Since this is not a ticketed event this year, the Lecture Series Committee decided to offer the series to the public at no charge. To support this generous offering, the Lecture Series Committee is grateful to acknowledge the support of First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, Kitty Robbins, and an anonymous donation in honor of former President George Dennison and his wife Jane as this year's lecture series sponsors. If you enjoy these lectures and wish to support them now and in the future, please feel free to visit the Alumni Association website and make a donation of your own. As always, these lectures are the result of a lot of work on the part of the Community Lecture Series Committee made up of Kitty Robbins, Joe Batt, Robert Stubblefield, Chris Comer, and Peggy Coeur. Jody Moreau of the Alumni Association office and student Lindsay House have provided indispensable support in the organization and production of the series. The committee has chosen for this year's series the theme, Our Environment Matters. From the waters of Montana to the wildfires of the Northwest, this year's lectures will explore human impact on environmental sustainability and how changes in the environment affect our lives and how we live in the world. This year's series will showcase 6 of UM's finest professors as they share rich and exciting research happening at the University of Montana and beyond. As always, following the lecture's presentation, there will be an opportunity for members of the audience to ask questions so that our experience can be broadened. To do that, simply click on the chat function on Zoom and submit your question. If you're watching on Facebook, post your questions or comments in the comments section. We will get to as many of those questions as we can, but we will have a clear ending point for tonight's event at 8:30. As always, the lecture series has received a media assistance grant from MCAT, now housed in Missoula's wonderful new public library, to record the lectures for later viewing. We don't yet have a schedule for when the lectures will be run, but we will announce that at a later date. Most of us in Western Montana have at one time or another enjoyed the beauty and recreation of Flathead Lake. Swimming, fishing, boating, or simply enjoying the breathtaking vistas offer so many soul-enhancing opportunities. But Flathead Lake, like all elements of our environment, is undergoing pressures and changes that are affecting the lake right before our eyes. Or should I say, right before the eyes of tonight's lecturer, Tom Bansak, of the University of Montana Biological Research Station on Yellow Bay at Flathead Lake. Tom has been associated with the Flathead Lake Biostation for over 25 years, first as a student, then as a researcher, a role he continues, while also serving as the biostation's assistant director. Tom's ongoing research has provided him with many insights into the health of Flathead Lake and the changes that are occurring there and what they mean for our continued beneficial relationship with the lake. Tom received his BA from Dartmouth College and his MS from the University of Montana. Tonight's lecture is Shrimp, Salmon, and Trout, an Invasive Chowder in Flathead Lake. Please join me in welcoming Tom Bansak.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And I'd like to thank everyone that helped organize this series and as well as the sponsors. I know it's a big effort to put something like this together, and it's a great opportunity for me. So thank you very much. All right. So it looks like I got the slides going. That's always the hardest part of the whole talk, getting the IT set up. And as mentioned, my name is Tom Bansak. I work at the Flathead Lake Biological Station. And we are located on the east shore of Flathead Lake in Yellow Bay, about halfway between Big Fork and Polson. We've got a wonderful facility there. We've got about 80 acres and 60 buildings, and I invite you all to come visit your biological station on Flathead Lake. We're one of the oldest biological stations in the nation, founded in 1899. And for 120 plus years, we've been keeping our finger on the pulse of Flathead Lake, the water quality of the biological community. Our biostation mission is threefold. We serve the Flathead, Montana, the nation, and the world by advancing a cutting-edge research, education, and outreach platform for limnology, which is the study of inland waters, ecology, and environmental science. We conduct advanced research. We're a world-renowned freshwater research facility. We've worked on almost every continent now. We've got one faculty member who goes to Antarctica every winter, our winter, their summer, and he studies the lakes that form above and below the ice in Antarctica. He actually scuba dives through the ice in Antarctica. I'm a scuba diver, and no thank you. I have no interest in that. So brave researcher doing stuff like that. Education, we have been running field classes since 1899. We have a K through 12 education program. So every student in Western Montana can learn about Flathead Lake and be engaged by the scientists and science of the biostation. And our faculty mentor graduate students year round. And then our flagship program is our long-term monitoring of waters of the Flathead, in particular, Flathead Lake and associated rivers. We have summer plans in person for 2022, and I just want to put out the student opportunities. As I mentioned, we've been running field ecology classes since 1899. We are possibly the longest running program of our type. Our classes spend lots of time outside in the natural environment, Flathead Lake, Glacier Park, the other areas of the Flathead watershed. And we have a lot of scholarships, philanthropically funded scholarships, and that deadline is coming. We also have a summer internship program. It's interdisciplinary and it is paid because we want these opportunities to be available to all students, not just those who can afford not to work in the summer. And end of this week is the application deadline for that. So if any of you are undergrads or you have undergraduate students in your families, let them know about these opportunities, please. All right, that's where the biological station is located, about halfway up the east shore of Flathead Lake. In the upper left corner is Glacier National Park, and the upper right corner is the Bob Marshall Wilderness. So Flathead Lake is fed by an enormous swath of pristine wildland, and that greatly helps us with water quality in the Flathead. More than 60% of the Flathead watershed is protected wildland. So a little bit about this lake that we all love. It is the largest natural freshwater lake by surface area in the Western US. I have to have all those premises in there because there are man-made reservoirs like Fort Peck that are larger. The Great Salt Lake is larger, but it's not freshwater, it's saltwater. And I have to say by surface area because there's this little lake in California and Nevada that makes the same claim of being the largest natural freshwater lake in the Western US. That's Lake Tahoe. And they technically have more water because they are deeper. Flathead Lake's about 400 feet deep, Tahoe's over 1,000 feet deep. But if you look at us from space, by surface area, Flathead Lake is larger. So I'm going to go with Flathead Lake is larger than Tahoe. Flathead is the 79th largest lake in the world. It's always exciting to crack the top 100 global list of anything. And of the large lakes in the world, we're definitely one of the cleanest. And long-term director, my former boss and good friend, Jack Stanford, used to say that of the large lakes in the world with people living around it, Flathead is the cleanest. Because a lot of the large lakes in the world are up in the far north. They're in Alaska, they're in British Columbia, they're in Russia or Siberia, where there aren't a lot of people yet. But here in the Flathead, we have significant human development, and we still have one of the cleanest lakes in the world. We have world-renowned water quality and clarity here. Clarity has how clear the water is. Quality has a number of other constituents that we look at. And people literally come from around the planet to see what crystal clear, abundant blue water looks like. We are so fortunate to have in the Flathead and much of Western Montana, water everywhere. You look out your back window and there's gorgeous, stunning views with crystal clear blue water. Unfortunately, that is not the norm in the world. Most water is scarce, it is murky brown, it is green, it's polluted. And just here in Montana, we're so fortunate. And when we engage local K through 12 students, we try to hit that home, how fortunate they are to have Flathead Lake as their normal, to have abundant, clear, clean blue water as their normal. And here in the Flathead, a lot of people come to this region to experience this abundant, clear, clean blue water. In this biostation here, we've got one of the best lake data sets in the world. And we've got some information going back to our founding in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but we put a rigorous scientific protocol in place in the 1970s. And that was in response to the threat of large-scale coal mining that was proposed in the Canadian portion of our watershed. The North Fork Flathead River starts in southeastern British Columbia, and southeastern British Columbia is made out of coal. About 40% of the world's steelmaking coal comes from about a 4 to 5 hour drive from Flathead Lake. And in the 1970s, there were plans to mine the coal in the Flathead portion of southeastern British Columbia. And people on both sides of the border got together and said a healthy Flathead Lake has more value, both ecological value and economic value, than 20 years of coal mining in Canada. So the mines never happened, but we were ready. And we put a monitoring program in place in the 1970s, expecting to see a water quality before mining and then water quality after mining. But because the mining never happened, we have this wonderful long-term record. And long-term data sets are even more and more valuable today with all the development and climate change and things that are going on the planet. So we are world-renowned for our long-term Flathead Lake and Flathead watershed monitoring. All right, a few pictures of some monitoring through the ages, some early sample collection from Yellow Bay Biological Station scientists. Here's one showing sampling through the ice, winter sampling out on Flathead Lake, back when Flathead Lake used to freeze. The last time Flathead Lake froze all the way across was 1988. And so we have records showing that Flathead Lake used to freeze about once a decade on average, but it's been a few decades since then. So something is changing. A few more picture of the modern era of our monitoring program. We have got a lot of dedicated scientists who are out on the lake every month of the year doing the same routine that was set up in the 1970s. We've even brought some local celebrities out on the lake with us. Monty did some monitoring for us. Unfortunately, we had to let him go. His manual dexterity wasn't great and he kept getting in the way, but it was fun to have Monty out there with us anyhow. This is one of the things that we monitor for. This is what we don't want to happen. We don't want Flathead Lake to turn green. We don't want an algae bloom like this due to human-caused nutrient pollution. Events like these things happen periodically, but consistently, that is not what we see in Flathead Lake. So here's a little bit of our monitoring data. The black and white disc in the upper corner is called a Secchi disc, and it is one of the longest used scientific instruments. The Pope's oceanographer invented it during the Renaissance period, I believe. And the way it works is you lower that, basically a dinner plate, down into the water until you cannot see it anymore. And then you measure how long the rope is as you pull it back in. And the deeper into the water it goes, that you can still see it, the better the water clarity is, how clear that water is. So a deeper reading means the water is more clear, less polluted, and has higher clarity. And so we've got over 40 years of Secchi disc readings of water clarity for Flathead Lake, and that's what this graph shows. And you can see a little bit of kind of variability and scatter, and that is natural. Anyone who's been in Montana in the springtime knows that the rivers get large, they swell up with snow melt, and they get muddy and cloudy. Faster moving water can carry more sediment and bring that downstream, deposit it other places, and that's natural and normal. So there's going to be some natural changes over the course of a year. So that's what that kind of noise is in that graph. There's a question on the bottom. Do you know what the best thing is about these data? The best thing about these data is that there's no trend. Most lakes are losing their clarity. They're getting cloudier, browner, and greener. Flathead Lake is not. We have the same amount of crystal clear visibility today that we did when we started doing this rigorously in the 1970s. In fact, a couple of years ago, we got some of the best water clarity readings we've seen in over 20 years. Our data from Flathead Lake is regularly used in global lake comparisons and studies that are looking at water quality around the globe. And Flathead Lake continues to stand out as an anomaly, as an outlier. As I mentioned, most of these lakes are suffering from nutrient pollution due to human activities, or they are getting less clear, and that's not the case for Flathead Lake. We're still doing great. World-renowned.
Alexa will walk in, and then
clarity.
I'll be in the middle of this. So let me just run upstairs.
Lake Tahoe is a bit of a sister lake for us, and Lake Tahoe's water clarity has declined quite dramatically over the last 40 years. And that figure down in the bottom shows that, 1960 something, you could see 30 meters into Lake Tahoe, and today you can only see about 20 meters into Lake Tahoe. So the water clarity in Tahoe has decreased by about a third during roughly the same time period that Flathead Lake hasn't. So again, it's wonderful to report great news. Flathead Lake is as clear today as it was when you were here, when you remember it, or before your kids were born, even in some cases. All right, so monitoring, keeping your finger on the pulse of a water body is really important. And one of our greatest assets in Montana is our world-renowned water quality. And the biostation is working with a number of partners to watch for changes, to watch for the canary in the coal mine, the warning signs. And like I said, fortunately in Flathead Lake, we have not seen those. But we work with a lot of partners. On Flathead Lake in particular, we work with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. The biostation and our long-term monitoring site are on the Flathead Reservation of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. The Flathead Lakers is a long-term partner, a nonprofit that's goal is to help protect Flathead Lake. We work with them on aquatic invasive species monitoring and shoreline erosion issues. And then that bear there is the Flathead Lake Open Water Swimmers. There's a group based in Polson, and they swim around the length of Flathead Lake. They're very, very strong and brave people to do that because of the distance and because of the cold water. Well, they started a program cooperatively with us called the Swim Guide, where since they're spending so much time in the water with their faces in the water, they wanted to make sure that Flathead Lake was clean from biological contaminants like E. coli and fecal coliform. And so they regularly monitor during the summer the busy beaches and state parks and swim areas around the lake. They bring the samples back to our lab for analyses to make sure that Flathead Lake is free from biological contaminants. And Flathead Lake regularly scores really well for those tests. A couple other major lakes in the Flathead that we've been working on for decades are Whitefish Lake and Swan Lake. We've got long-term monitoring on Whitefish Lake with the Whitefish Lake Institute as a partner, and then the Swan Lakers Watershed Group set up a volunteer monitoring program that we help with and analyze data for in Swan Lake. Every couple of decades, Glacier National Park reaches out to us, and so we are starting up some research and monitoring on Lake McDonald, one of the iconic water bodies of Montana and Glacier National Park. So it's exciting to get back there. We worked there in the late 80s. We worked there around 2000 and started up again last year. So we will be checking in on Lake McDonald, which unfortunately is seeing some nutrient pollution, especially from aging and failing septic systems from the old camps around the lake. And then a couple years ago, with philanthropic funding, the biostation started a program called Monitoring Montana Waters. And there are a lot of watershed groups around the state who care about their backyards and want to collect data that can be used for sound management of their waters, but they don't always have the resources or the scientific expertise to do that in a scientifically valid method. So we have been engaging these watershed groups around the state to help them get monitoring programs set up, to help them plan their study designs in a scientifically valid way. And then our laboratory at the biological station helps them by analyzing samples as well. So we are based in the Flathead, but our reach is beyond that. And with Monitoring Montana Waters program, we're reaching out to watershed groups around the state to help provide them with scientific expertise for their goal of ultimately understanding and protecting the waters that they care about. All right, so back to the biological station, and I'm sure you all rely on your local ecologist for your economic information, but this next slide is, in my mind, one of the most important ones to communicate and convey. I'm fascinated by the science of fresh waters, but I know I can put an entire room to sleep with the stuff that I'm interested in. But everybody cares about economics. Anyone who has a job, a property, a pocketbook cares about the economics. And here in the Flathead and much of Montana on the whole, we benefit greatly from the natural resources and the environment that we have here. And we have a natural resource economist here at the biological station, a woman named Annette Nelson, and she and Lori Curtis from the Whitefish Lake Institute, they did a study last year looking at the economic benefits, the property value benefits that our healthy lakes here in the Flathead provide. And their economic analysis showed that the healthy lakes of Flathead, Whitefish, and Swan boost property values by $2.2 to $3.3 billion. That's not chump change. Those are big numbers that get the attention of county commissioners, tax assessors, and representatives in Helena. So our healthy waters provide us with significant economic benefits. In this particular case, it's property values. And that's not just shoreline property values. That even includes homes that are in proximity to the lakes. Here in the Flathead and Flathead and Lake counties, tourism and non-resident spending make almost a quarter of our economy. And I've looked at data from 2007 as well as recent data from 2016, and it was about the same proportion. So it's a very, very consistent driver of our economy and the largest single contributor. And some of these studies showed that natural resources comprise 8 of the 9 top reasons vacationers visit Montana. So people are coming here to see Glacier Park. They're coming here to see Flathead Lake, Bob Marshall Wilderness. They're coming here because we have intact ecosystems and wonderful natural resources to enjoy recreationally and aesthetically. Unfortunately, there's all kinds of examples that ecological degradation corresponds to economic declines. As goes Flathead Lake, so goes the entire Flathead. One example to tell you about is related to water clarity, how clear the water is. And Lake Champlain is a large lake in between New York State and Vermont back east. And the University of Vermont did a study looking at as the water clarity, how clear Lake Champlain is, as that declines, what are the associated economic impacts? And they showed that as water clarity declines, if you can see 3 feet less into Lake Champlain, that annual tourism revenue decreased by $17 million, and some shoreline property values decreased by up to 37%. That is crazy. Could you imagine owning a shoreline home and having the property value go down by almost 40% because the lake went from blue to green or brown? It's staggering to me, but it's really a valuable study to tell us what could happen in these waters of Montana if we let them get polluted, murky brown, green. We all could lose the economic benefits associated with healthy, clear blue water. Aquatic invasive species is another major threat to waters globally, nationwide in Montana, and here in the Flathead. And when a new aquatic invader gets to a water body, its desirability declines. And then market forces take over. And if the desirability of properties along a particular water body declines, then the shoreline property values decline as well. And I found studies from, one of them is from across the US, one of them is from Vermont, one of them is from Wisconsin, one of them is from Washington state, showing that when you get a new aquatic invader to a water body, property values could decrease by almost 20%. Well, 20% of $2 to $3 billion is a big number. And especially with aquatic invasive species, the old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure holds true. We don't want to let them get here, because once they get here, they'll have all kinds of ecological ramifications, but there are lots of negative economic ramifications too if a new invader gets to a new water body. And as I mentioned, the biostation has a natural resource economist, and the state contracted with her to do an economic damage report if invasive mussels were to get to Montana and become widespread. And her economic analysis showed that it could cost Montana over $200 million per year if invasive mussels became widespread throughout the state of Montana. This was the first study of its type that was done in the Western US. And after Montana's study was done by Nanette, she did one of these studies for South Dakota, and then she's been working with Kansas to do another one. Again, to show the economic reasons why we should protect our ecosystems. In this case, keeping out invasive mussels, the zebra quagga mussels. So here are a couple of those studies that I just mentioned. I just want to point out that the $200+ million per year is lost revenue and mitigation costs, less people coming to Montana, less tourism, and then the costs associated with fixing water delivery systems, whether it's a power plant, a municipal supply, or agricultural water distribution systems. A couple $100 million per year, and that does not include potential impacts to property values, which could be almost $500 million. So again, it's in our economic best interest to protect our waters, our wonderful waters in Montana. All right, so here's the real story you came to listen to and watch today. Flathead Lake, shrimp, salmon, and trout, invasive chowder in Flathead Lake. So this figure, I'm going to show several figures that kind of look like this. I want to explain how they work. One, this is Flathead Lake, and you'll see that I am an ecologist, not an artist. But in this slide, the fish icons, the size of them indicates the abundance of a fish, not its actual size. So PC in the biggest icon there, that is P-mouth chub. That's a little feeder fish, and historically, that was the most abundant fish in Flathead Lake. Below that is northern pike minnow, a large predatory minnow. Below that is the bull trout, native top predator. Another something about this figure is where you see the fish icon is roughly where you would find it in the lake. So a bull trout is an ambush predator from below. That's why you see it in the deep part of the lake. In the center, WCT, that is West Slope cutthroat trout, Montana's state fish, and they tend to swim and feed near the surface. S off to the edge are suckers, a couple of species of suckers, and then MWF is mountain whitefish, the native whitefish to Western Montana. And then in the middle, those are the zooplankton. Those are the little organisms out in the lake that basically are fish food, and they're the kind of the core of the biological community. So Flathead Lake historically, this data, our biostation data from 1915, 1916, historically Flathead Lake only had 8 to 10 species of fish. But 8 to 10 species of fish for a lake the size of Flathead isn't that many. A lake the size of Flathead in the southeastern US where it hasn't been glaciated might have 30 or 40 species of fish. A lake the size of Flathead in the tropics might have 300 species of fish. So when people of European descent first got to Flathead Lake, especially the fisheries managers, they said 8 to 10 species of fish, that's nothing. We can do better than that. And It makes sense if you think about it, though, because Flathead Lake 15,000 years ago was ice, and it's hard to make a living in ice as a fish. So the 8 to 10 species of fish that we have here had to have gotten to Flathead Lake after Flathead Lake became a liquid water lake again and not an ice sheet. 15,000 years isn't typically enough time for a new species to evolve. So these are fishes that got back into the lake after the most recent recession of the ice. So when the well-intentioned state and federal fisheries managers got to Flathead Lake, they said, we can do better than this. And between 1890 and 1950, they introduced everything they could think of, including the kitchen sink, to Flathead Lake to make it better. And they introduced over 30 species of fish into Flathead Lake to see what would take. So here we've got the list of native species in white. These are the original 8 to 10 species of fish, bull trout being the native top predator, West Slope cutthroat trout being another charismatic trout that people enjoy. And then I mentioned the native mountain whitefish. In the other column, the non-native fishes, those are the ones of those 30 plus fish that were introduced that took. These are the ones that have self-sustaining populations after that original introduction. And you can see in parentheses, you have the years of the introduction. So a couple things on this slide is in the non-native species list, there's a lot of fish that you recognize. They're the fish that people like to catch and eat. Lake trout from the Midwest, rainbow trout from California, brook trout from the Eastern Mountains, bass from the Southeast, pike from the Midwest. So well-intentioned fishery managers were introducing fishes that people like to catch and eat to provide angling and food fishing opportunities. The other thing you can see in the parentheses is a lot of old dates, 1905, 1910, 1913, 1898. So a lot of these fishes were introduced a long, long time ago to enhance the community of Flathead Lake. That's what you did back then as a fisheries manager. You made it better. So after this era of stocking, we have another one of these figures showing the Flathead Lake fish and aquatic community in the 1980s. And we call this the kokanee era. But you can see that the diagram is a little bit more crowded. Down at the bottom, we now see LT, which is lake trout from the Great Lakes, and LW, lake whitefish, also from the Great Lakes. YP is yellow perch, but that middle one, KOK, is kokanee salmon. I want to talk a little bit about kokanee salmon. So kokanee salmon is a landlocked Pacific sockeye salmon. And the normal life cycle of a Pacific salmon is you're born in freshwater, you live in freshwater for a year, 2, maybe 3, depending on the species. When you're a couple inches long, you head out to the ocean. You migrate from your home stream out to the ocean because there's a lot more food out there. And so you spend 2, 3, 4 years out in the ocean, again, depending on the species. You eat. And when you return to your home stream, you might be 20, 30 pounds. King salmon get to be over 100 pounds. So you might leave your home stream when you're a couple inches long, you come back, you're a couple feet long, and you put on a lot of weight. And when Pacific salmon return to the stream where they were born, to their spawning streams, they stop feeding and they start digesting their own biomass, essentially. They lay or fertilize eggs, and then they die, and they feed their kids with their decomposing carcass. It's the ultimate parental sacrifice, and any of you that have kids understand what I'm talking about. So here in the Flathead, the salmon could not get to and from the ocean, even before all of the dams. There were natural barriers or big waterfalls near the Montana-Idaho border. So the salmon here in Flathead Lake, which were introduced in the early 1900s by fisheries managers, they used Flathead Lake as their ocean, and they would swim upstream into the river system to reproduce. And there are a handful of places that they congregated to spawn, to reproduce in the fall. And I want to point out that these salmon were very, very popular. There were hundreds of thousands of them in Flathead Lake, and they were delicious. You can can them, you could fillet them, you could smoke them, people would come from all over Montana and surrounding areas to put up fish and food for the winter. The limit, I was told, was about 30 a day. And so you could really catch a lot of great tasting protein from these salmon runs. And the salmon would run upstream into the river system during the late summer, early fall. One of the places that they would congregate was McDonald Creek, right near Apgar on the west edge of Glacier National Park. So these salmon would come upstream through the river system, and in a pretty narrow and shallow creek, 100,000 plus salmon could be congregating to spawn to reproduce in the fall. Well, many of you probably recognize that in the fall, there are some hungry critters hanging out in Montana, and finding a fat and protein rich food source in a shallow stream worked in their favor. And so during the Kokanee era, there became large congregations of bald eagles and bears who would come down to these spawning creeks to nab themselves some high levels of protein and fat. So basically, we had Alaska in Montana. We had an internationally known wildlife spectacle in Glacier Park each fall. Salmon running out of Flathead Lake up into the river system and into Glacier Park in particular. Well, if you have a internationally known wildlife viewing spectacle, you get tourists and you get camera coating tourists. And people would come from around the world, Europeans wearing neon and carrying $10,000 cameras, trying to get that picture of a bear nabbing a salmon. A lot easier to get to Montana than it is to get to Alaska. And so Glacier Park had this significant fall tourist season to watch this internationally known wildlife spectacle. Well, if you're in charge of a very, very popular fishery and internationally known wildlife spectacle, what do you want to do? You want to try to make it better, of course. So here is the salmon food. This is a native zooplankton known as a daphnia, and it's about the size of a point of a pencil. And that's what the salmon were feeding on predominantly. This is a mysis shrimp. This is also a zooplankton, but is much larger, gets to be about an inch long, and is not native to Western Montana or the Pacific Northwest. These mysis shrimp come from the Great Lakes and the Canadian Shield area of South Central Canada. But during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, well-meaning fisheries managers introduced them widely throughout Western North America, many of the lakes throughout Western North America, under the premise that a larger food package would yield you more and better fish. So mysis shrimp were introduced widely to enhance fisheries populations. Unfortunately, in Flathead Lake, that's not how it played out. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but the shrimp eat the native zooplankton. Our monitoring program in Flathead Lake first detected mysis shrimp in Flathead Lake in 1983. In this article from the Missoulian in 1983, immediately the biostation said these shrimp are a problem for the salmon population in the biological community of Flathead Lake. All right, so I'm a scientist, got to give you a graph. So we've got years on the horizontal x-axis and abundance of different species on the vertical y-axis. And starting in 1979, the kind of salmon-colored bar, those are the Kokanee salmon in McDonald Creek alone. And if you look at 1984, there were over 120,000 salmon in that one creek in Glacier near Apgar. It's a lot of fish in a pretty small area. Then the white bars are the eagles, the bald eagles that would arrive from British Columbia, maybe all the way down from Mexico, because they heard about this fall fish fry going on in Glacier National Park. And then the red line, those are the mysis shrimp. So mysis are not native to the Flathead. They were introduced by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks into a number of different lakes in the Flathead in the 60s and the 70s. 1978 or so, they were introduced to Swan Lake. which is about 15 river miles upstream from Flathead Lake. So if they were introduced in 78 or 79, we first detected them in Flathead Lake in 1983. So they moved downstream and got to Flathead Lake. And then the population exploded of the mysis shrimp. And then it dropped off a little bit. And that explosion and that drop off is very common when you get a new invasive species to an ecosystem. They show up, there's abundant food resources, no one's keying in on them as something to eat, and then they drop back down to some kind of medium level where they sustain for long periods of time in most cases. So the mysis population exploded between 84 and 86, 87, and then dropped off by the late 80s. But if you look at the salmon, in 1983, there were over 300,000 salmon in Flathead Lake. By 1987, there were 0. This is one of Flathead Lake and the biostation's most famous stories because we were out there monitoring, collecting this data, and by chance, due to our monitoring program, we captured a significant ecological event. This is literally a textbook example of oops, and is in the ecology textbooks. Right, so the mysis got here, they exploded in numbers. We still monitor for the mysis annually. Going back to 83 when they were first detected. When we sample the mysis shrimp, we have to sample them at night. They vertically migrate and are down near the bottom during the day, and then they come up at night. And we do it on the new moon because even the light of the moon will prevent them from migrating. So that red light is what our team uses when they're out sampling in the middle of the night, sometimes every month of the year out on Flathead Lake. And so you can see from this longer term data set that the mysis exploded, dropped back down, and now they kind of fluctuate around a medium level. Well, what happened to those 300,000 salmon, and how did the shrimp impact those salmon? Well, it turns out that salmon are visual feeders. I mean, scientists knew this, but they feed near the surface during the day when there's light and they can see the little zooplankton, little animals. Mysis shrimp spend all day down on the bottom. And so the shrimp and salmon never saw each other, really. The salmon never had access to the shrimp as a food source. But then the shrimp come up from the bottom at night and they feed on the zooplankton. They feed on the salmon food. So it's kind of this double whammy for the salmon where they didn't have access to the shrimp that were supposed to be their new food source. And the shrimp actually became a direct competitor for the salmon, causing that catastrophic population crash between 83 and 87. I wanted to mention that this change in an entire food web or community due to the arrival of one species is known as a trophic cascade. And the shrimp arriving, causing the salmon to disappear and the eagles to go elsewhere, would be this cascade of the community in the upward direction. However, we also documented a trophic cascade in the downward direction. So zooplankton, the little fish food in the lake, we had abundance data where from the 1970s there, where every liter of water at Flathead Lake might have 65 or 70 of these little animals swimming around in the lake. When the mysis shrimp arrived and fed voraciously on the zooplankton that were there, their numbers declined. So you can see between 73 and 1986 there that the abundance of zooplankton, the amount of fish food in the lake, dropped by more than half. And maybe the long-term trend there is, about 60% of the fish food in Flathead Lake today after the arrival of the shrimp in comparison to before the shrimp's arrival. So we're seeing this cascade in the downward direction where the abundance of native fish food declined dramatically. We also saw a big change in the quality of the fish food. Before the mysis arrived, there were large, tasty zooplankton like Daphnia there. Don't they look good? And after the mysis arrived and basically ate the good stuff, we're left with smaller, less nutritious, spinier, zooplankters with more defenses. So not only did the quantity of native fish food decline, but also the quality did, all from the arrival of this one little shrimp and these cascading effects. The effects didn't stop there with the little animals in the lake. We've also seen a change in the plants in the lake, the algae, the free-floating plants that make Flathead Lake green, that are the base of the food web. And so the amount of algal production, how much the algae were growing, before the mysis period was down around, 80 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. Then the mysis arrived, and you see 87, 88, 89, we see the algae, the amount of green producers in the lake going through the roof. And that was a worrisome period. And then since then, we kind of see some fluctuations around a new normal of about 100 grams per carbon. I like this graph for a number of reasons. One, because it shows the value of a long-term data set. And, if we just had, 5 or 6 years of data, we could conclude incorrectly what was going on here. Between 91 and 95, we could say the amount of algae in the lake is going down. Between 95 and 99, we could say it's going up. Between 85 and 89, we're seeing this explosion of algal growth during the reorganization of the food web with the arrival of mysis. But when we've analyzed this, multiple times and ways, we don't see an increasing trend. We actually see what's called a step function. So before the shrimp, we basically have two Flathead lakes. We have a Flathead lake before the shrimp and a Flathead lake after the shrimp. Before the shrimp, the algal production levels were about 80 grams of carbon. And then after the mysis arrived and the lake kind of settled into its new normal, we now have a new Flathead lake that's a little bit greener and has a little bit more algal production, because you have the mysis shrimp eating the zooplankton that eat the algae. So with less zooplankters consuming algae, we're going to have more algae in a slightly greener Flathead lake. So this is a way in which the arrival of that one species trickled and rippled throughout the entire community in the upward and downward direction. We've even got some evidence showing that the nutrient dynamics of the lake possibly have changed following the arrival of mysis shrimp. So people previously didn't think the arrival of one species could change everything about an ecosystem, from the nutrients to the terrestrial and aerial predators, 50 miles away, but it can. All right, so here's a graph to show you another way to look at the change in the community following the arrival of the shrimp. So the native species in gray before the shrimp were highly abundant. After the shrimp arrived, their numbers decreased. And the exotic, or the non-native species, they were around as bit players initially, but when the shrimp arrived, their numbers really exploded. And here's why. So lake whitefish, now the most abundant fish in Flathead Lake, and lake trout, possibly second or third most abundant fish in Flathead Lake, they evolved in the Great Lakes with mysis shrimp. Lake whitefish and lake trout were both introduced to Flathead Lake in the early 1900s, late 1800s, but they were bit players for decades. They tend to live in the deep, dark bottom and feed on what's down there. Well, before the shrimp, we didn't have a lot of food in the deep, dark bottom of Flathead Lake. When the mysis shrimp arrived, their favorite food arrived and their populations exploded. Lake whitefish, by the last estimates I've seen, there's about 2.5 million lake whitefish in Flathead Lake. Lake whitefish are from Lake Superior of the Great Lakes. They feed on the bottom, predominantly on invertebrates, like the mysis shrimp. And so when their favorite food arrived, their numbers just exploded. Lake trout, also from the Great Lakes, also lives in the deep, dark bottom, also was introduced in the early 1900s. Their juveniles live in the deep, dark bottom, feeding on invertebrates like their favorite food, mysis shrimp. And so when there is plenty of food for the juvenile lake trout with the arrival of the shrimp, then you get more and more juveniles surviving to adulthood. And when lake trout become adults, they become voracious predators, feeding on other fishes. They're piscivores. And I call them lake sharks. They will eat lots and lots of lake whitefish. They will eat our native and threatened bull trout. They will eat other lake trout. They will eat their own kids. They don't care. And they can eat a fish up to 60% their own body size without chewing. Pretty remarkable feat. And I don't recommend it at the dinner table. But by last counts, there are about 2.5 million lake whitefish, about 1 million lake trout, and our native bull trout is down to about 10 or 15,000 fish in Flathead Lake. So the arrival of this shrimp greatly altered the community to basically we've converted a Rocky Mountain lake into a Great Lake through largely intentional fisheries introductions. And lake trout, lake whitefish, and mysis shrimp, I call them the triumvirate of terror. Those 3 non-native species now run Flathead Lake. So another graph, a little bit noisier here, but we saw the original graph with the kokanee and the eagles and the mysis explosion and then dropping back down. You can see that magenta looking line is kind of fluctuating around a new norm. Bull trout is green, and bull trout were more abundant before the arrival of the shrimp. They've dropped down to lower levels, and yellow, the lake trout, have really expanded their numbers and their populations in Flathead Lake. So there's another piece of the story here that relates to lake trout. So the shrimp arrived, the kokanee salmon disappeared, the lake whitefish and the lake trout are starting to do well because they've got their favorite food. Well, society, we liked the salmon, and the state of Montana spent $1 million a year during the 90s to grow salmon, baby salmon, in fish factories called hatcheries, and then they would release them into the wild in Flathead Lake. Very common fisheries technique to grow baby fishes and then release them. Well, one of the places that they released them was Yellow Bay State Park. And when they would release some of these baby fishes, we sent some scientists out with nets. This was before my time, but I'll say we. And they were catching lake trout with distended bellies and tails sticking out of their mouths. Lake trout that couldn't physically put another baby fish in their gullet. And so unintentionally, we embarked upon a $1 million a year, 10-year lake trout feeding program by providing them all these baby salmon in places like Yellow Bay. And during that time, there were very, very few salmon that were caught. I read one place that, in 10 years, three salmon were caught by anglers. Well, if you do the math on $10 million over a 10-year period, that's $3.3 million per fish that anglers caught. So it was not a good return on investment, because anywhere that the shrimp, the salmon, and lake trout have been together, the shrimp and the lake trout win, the salmon decline. That happened in Lake Pend Oreille and Coeur d'Alene downstream from us. It happened in several other lakes around the west. So we have that perfect mix of growing big lake trout here in Flathead Lake. All right, so here's a bull trout, historically our top predator. And the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes have a very strong historical and cultural connection to the bull trout. And today, our top predator in Flathead Lake is the lake trout, also known as Mackinaw. And the Montana state record came out of Flathead Lake. And so it is a robust fish species that people like to fish for. But basically, the top predator of Flathead Lake has been replaced. The bull trout, which are now on the endangered species list as threatened and are down to maybe 15,000 in Flathead Lake, have been replaced by 1 million non-native Midwesterners, which is what the Flathead feels like sometimes, right? The tribes have taken it upon themselves to try to knock back lake trout to give the native bull trout a chance. And they've done this in a number of different ways. The tribes, due to their cultural and historical connection to the fish, want to give bull trout a chance. Interestingly, the state, which co-manages Flathead Lake, they have managed 4 trophy lake trout. And Flathead Lake is a divided lake on paper. The south half is managed by the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes, and the north half is managed by the state of Montana and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And at times, there have been two management agencies on one water body managing in opposite directions. The tribes are trying to reduce the lake trout. The state is trying to grow bigger and better trophy lake trout for angling opportunities. So it's an interesting dynamic when you have two agencies that agree to disagree and are managing in opposite directions. The tribes have used a number of different techniques to remove the lake trout. At present, they are using commercial gill netting technology. At first, they brought in some commercial fishers from the Great Lakes where they have fished down species like lake trout. And now the tribes have their own boat, their own nets, and they're out there throughout the year trying to knock back the numbers of lake trout to give the bull trout a chance. There's a million hungry lake trout out there. We want to reduce those numbers. Another technique they've been using is Mac Days and Mac Attack. Fishing derbies is a long-term used fisheries management tool. And so there's thousands of dollars of prizes every year to pay out to anglers who are catching and killing lake trout from Flathead Lake to reduce those numbers. There's a handful of fish out there that have a tag in them that are worth $10,000. And if one of the fishing derby participants catches that fish, they turn it in, they get $10,000 right away. But they've got prizes for everything. They've got the most fish caught, the largest fish caught, the most fish caught by the youngest angler, the biggest fish caught by the oldest angler. A wide variety of prizes out there to incentivize anglers to catch and kill as many lake trout as possible to decrease those numbers that are impacting our native fishes dramatically. The tribes have also created a nonprofit corporation called Native Fish Keepers. After they catch and remove these non-native lake trout, they fillet them, they clean them, fillet them, flash freeze them, and they sell them. And they are selling Flathead lake trout around the nation on restaurant tables in New York, Chicago. Both UM and MSU cafeterias have sold them. They have served them before. We serve them at the biological station, especially when we have biological conferences, because invasive species are a widespread global problem that costs billions of dollars. And one of the solutions is us. There probably isn't a species, especially a fish species out there, that people haven't hunted down, towards extinction. We haven't caused extinction for all of them, but there's these abundant species out there that we don't want in the wrong places, and some of them taste great. So there are invasive species restaurant movements or invasive species recipe books and recipe sites. I recommend you checking them out. Invasivore.org is one of them. Frog leg piccata sounds pretty good. Jamaican jerk carp sounds pretty good. And my favorite is Kentucky tuna, which is illegal to use as a branding slogan. So Asian carp are taking over the Midwest. There are 4 main species of carp from Asia that are dominating the Midwestern rivers. And there was a branding effort to call it Kentucky tuna. And they taste really good, and chefs were trying to cook them up and serve them, and they wanted to rebrand them in an appealing way. And they tried Kentucky tuna, but unfortunately the Tuna Fishermen's Association sued them, saying that calling carp Kentucky tuna was a defamation to the tuna that they fish for and that people love. So you can't call them Kentucky tuna, but Asian carp are tasty. If you're down in the Southeast or Louisiana, you could have some delicious nutria. Nutria is a beaver-like invasive rodent that is taking over parts of our country. So we could cook them up with red cabbage and honey mustard sauce. Does sound good. All right, so Glacier National Park is in the Flathead watershed, and there are a number of different lakes that are on the west side of the park that are connected to the river system. And we wish these lake trout from Flathead Lake would stay in Flathead Lake, but they don't. They wander widely, they look for new habitat, they look for feeding opportunities. And Flathead lake trout have been found up in Canada. They've been found in the Great Bear Wilderness, hundreds of miles away from their new home, Flathead Lake. When I arrived in Montana in the mid-1990s, Glacier Park was a stronghold of native fishes, and especially those 10 or 12 lakes on the western edge of Glacier. Well, today, most of those lakes are dominated by lake trout. And so Glacier Park has gone from a stronghold of native fishes to one of the, the invasion of the Flathead lake trout has taken over a lot of those lakes. The park and the U.S. Geological Survey have been working on removing lake trout from a number of those lakes, from Quartz Lake, from Logging Lake, from Kintla, to give the bull trout a chance to remain in those lakes and sustain populations. Swan Lake has an ongoing battle between the native bull trout and the lake trout. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is removing as many lake trout as they can from Swan Lake. Yet just downstream in Flathead Lake, it's a desired angling species. So it becomes less of a biological topic and more of a societal values topic. All right. Non-native fish introductions by managers is a thing of the past. Society has more value today for our native species than we did back in the early 1900s, 50s, and 60s. So introductions to what we call open water bodies where non-native fishes can spread, those aren't done in Montana anymore. Unfortunately, the general public has now taken it upon itself to move these fishes around. And we can call it bucket biology, we call it Johnny Applefish, we call it a felony because it's a real problem. And here are just a few of the recently found invasive fishes in some lakes of western Montana. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Region 1, Northwest Montana, including the Flathead watershed, has more illegal fish introductions than the rest of the state combined. We have a fish introduction problem here in the Flathead. And no one really knows why, but maybe it's because we have more lakes than other parts of the state, or more people moving here from other parts of the nation who want to bring their favorite fishes with them. But it is problematic ecologically, it is against the law. There's even a significant reward put out by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and Trout Unlimited for information that results in an arrest. Unfortunately, arrests are very uncommon because it's usually one or two people in the dead of night who drive the fish from one water body to another. The one on the bottom there, walleye, is problematic. Walleye are popping up all over the place because they are delicious and they're flaky white meat. They're fun to fish for, but they're not native to western Montana. And walleye were a few years ago found in Swan Lake during routine Fish, Wildlife, and Parks fisheries monitoring. And it was a big concern because there shouldn't be walleye in Swan Lake, and adding another predator to a water body is going to cause all kinds of unexpected consequences. Well, FWP did analyses of the ear bone of the walleye that tell you what waters they grew up in, and it was shown that these walleye that were found in Swan Lake did not grow up in Swan Lake. They actually grew up in Lake Helena. So some angler who fishes in Lake Helena brought them in a bucket to Swan Lake and released them illegally, presumably at the dead of night, to make the fishing better there for them. But as we've seen from the arrival of the mysis shrimp, the arrival of one species can have dramatic and unexpected and negative results. So we do not want anyone moving around new fish species between our waters. All right, so the next thing to talk about is the potential invaders that might be coming. In particular, zebra and quagga mussels. We do not want these to get to western Montana or any water bodies in Montana. They are game changers. They dramatically change ecosystems. They coat everything. They can spin a thread and glue themselves to things, whether it's the lawn chair, whether it's that shopping cart, or that bottom picture is a beach in the Midwest with about 6 or 8 inches of dead mussel shells. Imagine what that smells like, right? They dramatically change ecosystems. They have ecological impacts, economic impacts, and aesthetic and recreational impacts as well. You know, these shells are razor sharp and they foster infection. So you're not going to walk barefoot on that beach that used to be sand. You're not going to walk your dog on that beach anymore. So we cannot let them get here. And I know a number of you have probably at least heard of the Flathead Lake monster. Maybe some of you have seen it, who knows? But I don't believe there's a dinosaur out there in Flathead Lake. But I think that the mussels themselves are the real Flathead Lake monster. If they got to Flathead Lake, irreversible changes would happen. So here is the diagram of the different kind of eras of Flathead Lake. You've got the original native community at the top. In the middle, you've got that kokanee era. And then on the bottom, you've got the mysis shrimp era. Remember, the size of the icon indicates the abundance of the organism. Well, if we got the invasive mussels in Flathead Lake, this is what that diagram could look like. Mussels can eat up to 80% of the food in a water body. And where they arrive, you see dramatic declines, even the eradication of fish species. Yep, I said that. Sometimes you get the mussels and you lose your fish. So all this talk about bull trout or lake trout or redfish, bluefish, greenfish, none of that would matter. You'd just be lucky to catch a fish if the mussels are in Flathead Lake eating 80% of the food. But there is hope because public awareness and early detection can help. So I want to point out right now that there have been a couple of detections of zebra quagga mussels in Montana, but none of them have been in western Montana. The Columbia watershed, which is the Clark Fork, Kootenai, and Flathead watersheds, are all mussel-free and have been. The Columbia watershed is the remaining largest watershed left in the US, in the Pacific Northwest, that doesn't have the mussels. The other major watersheds do. So Montana's detections have all been in the Missouri Basin, in Canyon Ferry Reservoir and Tiber Reservoir on the Marias River. So the mussels that you may have heard about in Montana are not in west of the divide. So the Flathead Lake in particular is mussel-free. And the hope of this is that prevention and early detection work. There are other states that have invested heavily in public awareness to talk about, hey, you need to clean, drain, dry your gear. Don't move between water bodies without clean, drain, drying your gear. Or if you're in a mussel water body, don't take your boat or rent fish. You should rent a boat or fishing gear instead. So public awareness works and public action is essential. And then early detection offers the best hope for eradication. The largest infestation of zebra and quagga mussels ever eradicated is about 20 acres in a lake in Minnesota, I believe. Flathead Lake is over 110,000 acres. If Flathead Lake got the mussels, there is no known technology to get rid of them. So we want to find them as soon as possible in a small localized area to eradicate them. And the biostation does a lot of that with a lot of partners. And we've actually developed some DNA detection technologies that are more sensitive and can be used year-round than traditional techniques of trying to capture the babies with a net. So we've been working for about a decade with a variety of partners to monitor over 40 lakes in western Montana, including Flathead Lake, for the DNA of new invaders. And if we find the DNA early, we can look to try to find those organisms and eradicate them as soon as possible. With invasive species, the sooner, like with cancer, the sooner you find them in a small localized area, the greater chance of success of getting rid of them is. And so we are working with a number of different partners to be out there vigilantly collecting samples and analyzing samples from around western Montana, looking for that needle in the haystack with the best available tools. And in a case like this, everyone pulling together offers the best opportunity for success. So kind of in sum, we have something special here with the waters of western Montana and the Flathead and Flathead Lake. We want to keep them blue and mussel-free, and all of us working together, it's in our best interest to invest in protecting our waters. And that's what I have for you. So I'm, again, honored to have this opportunity, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Great. Well, thank you, Tom. That was fascinating. I have to confess right off the top, 50 years ago, when I was a student at the university, I took that trip up to Apgar to see the coho and the eagles, and it was one of the most astonishing things I'd ever seen. Truly breathtaking, and I recall that the ranger, the naturalist, said that when the kokanee ran in Glacier Park, every animal in the park ate salmon. And he said, including deer, which just totally astonished me. But you think the bear's going down for lunch, deer were going down as well, and mice and whatever.
Yeah. The biostation did a large Pacific salmon study around the Pacific Rim in the early 2000s. And part of what we did was we tracked marine nutrients, the nutrients that the salmon were bringing into streams and into forests. And salmon nutrients have been detected in mountain goats.
Wow.
So the nutrients from the ocean can make it to the top highest peaks of mountain ranges in Alaska, as documented we use something called stable isotope. So thank you for sharing that, Jeff. I was not here at the time, and you may not like my phrasing, but you got to witness and are part of history for your trips to Apgar to see the salmon run.
Yeah, and it was so depressing to see that ended. And now I have a better understanding, as I'm sure everyone does, why that happened. Going back to the early part of your presentation, we had a question that also occurred to me, and that is, in the post-glacial period, how did the native species of fish get to Flathead Lake?
I wasn't here to witness it, but my understanding is the downstream, the furthest the ice made it in the fairly recent era would have been the moraine of Polson Hill. And so beyond Polson Hill, there was liquid water. Uh-huh. And there were refuges of non-ice water. And so kind of as the ice traveled, there was adjacent water that the fish were able to live in. And then as the ice receded, and what is Flathead Lake today became water again, the fish moved in. Organisms are very adaptable and flexible, and fish aren't going to survive in ice, but as soon as it's water again, they're going to find a way to get there. There's also a chance that native peoples helped move fishes around. We've seen documentation of that in some of the mountain lakes in western Montana, where during travel you'd want a food source at a particular mountain lake. Actually, one of the studies that the biostation is doing is up in Glacier Park at the new lakes that are forming as the glaciers recede. And so our director, Jim Elser, has a project with the U.S. Geological Survey looking at, as you get a new lake, what shows up first, and what is the community in that new nascent lake. And we haven't seen fish there yet, but fish are going to get there. There's documentation of fish raining from the sky from water spouts and dust devils, not dust devils, but the water equivalent. So fish get around. A bird, an osprey could catch a fish and then accidentally drop it, and that fish could become established in a different lake. So there's different ways.
Well, turning back to the topic about the mussels, one of our viewers tonight pointed out that there is a broadcast available on Montana Public Radio called Subsurface, which goes in depth about the mussel issue. So if any of the viewers tonight are interested in learning more, just go to mtpr.org and search around there, and you should be able to find a broadcast about the mussels. In your experience, or maybe you just get this secondhand like the rest of us, what have you heard is the public's response to all of these clean and dry stations? I know that when I travel around Montana in the western part of Montana in the summer, it seems like I always see somebody saying, pull over if you've got a boat for a mussel inspection. which I do. I mean, but what kind of sense do you have from the public's cooperation on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've been engaged with the battle against aquatic invasive species, gosh, over a decade now. And, 10 years ago, it was very frustrating because people weren't really aware of this threat. The mussels took over the Midwest in the 1980s, and they've been marching towards Montana ever since. And people that lived in other places or have been to mussel water bodies knew that this was a problem, but it's hard to get people motivated to address the idea of a threat until it's real. And I don't think people act until their back's against the wall. But the state and certainly a lot of partners in the Flathead have done a really great job in the last 5 or so years of raising awareness about this problem, about starting the public education campaigns. And when people understand what the threat and what the issue is, they are willing to help in whatever way they can. And when the boat inspection stations were first ramping up, the state and tribal partners and whoever else ran the boat inspection stations, they saw a lot of drive-bys. But the number of drive-bys has decreased dramatically in the last half decade because the boaters understand that pulling in for 5 minutes and talking to the well-meaning boat inspector and telling them where they've been and where they haven't been is protecting our waters. And so early on, there was this lack of awareness and it was just an inconvenience. Now that people have gotten into the habit of it, it's not that big a deal, especially for the regular boaters. Or if you're just moving around in the Flathead or just Western Montana, it's no big deal. It's trying to intercept the boats that are coming from afar from the mussel water bodies. So I've seen awareness and happy compliance go up dramatically in the last 5 years or so.
Yeah. I think your explanation of the mysis shrimp and the impact in the trophic cascade was also very, very interesting, very illuminating. And given humans' propensity to try to play God, has there been any thought or any possibility of eradicating the mysis shrimp without totally screwing everything up?
Oh, there's absolutely been lots of efforts in a lot of places, but no one's ever done it. And you get the shrimp, or you realize you don't want the shrimp after you've introduced it intentionally. Well, let's get rid of the shrimp. There are just so many of them that it seems it might be impossible. And if you look at Flathead Lake from above, each square meter of Flathead Lake might have 70 to 90 of these shrimp. So the numbers are staggering. Eradication was attempted downstream from us in Lake Pend Oreille in Idaho, where they harvested them for aquarium fish food. And what they found was that they actually had a viable business and they could catch lots of these mysis shrimp and they could sell them and make some money, but they didn't put a dent in the population at all. So nowhere on the planet has anyone ever eradicated the mysis shrimp. More recently, I've heard some talk about using some of the genetic technologies like CRISPR, where you insert a fatal or near fatal gene. There are some researchers working on that kind of thing, especially for other species, but hasn't been tried here. And I think most fisheries managers just kind of shrug and realize that, oh, we've got the shrimp's here to stay. But maybe there's a silver bullet out there. And I think you worry and wonder a little bit about perpetuating the problem of playing God, as you said.
I think your comments about the things that, for example, the tribe has been doing to eradicate the lake trout, and that the populations of the whitefish have gone up so high. Any help to amateur fishermen on how can we do better at catching those? I mean, I'd like to go out on the boat and I'd like to bring back a lot of fish. Is there a bait I should be using? Is there a lure? What should I use to catch those guys?
Every fisherman has their own strategy. for the lake trout, they tend to be in the deeper waters, and people target the deeper waters with different types of jigs and trolling. Interestingly, one of the changes that happened in Flathead Lake with the arrival of the shrimp was, kind of a loss of egalitarian fishing opportunities. Before the mysis showed up, there were a lot of surface fishes and a lot of fish that you could catch from the shore. Some kid from a dock could catch cutthroat trout or salmon. But with that concentration of food down near the bottom with the mysis shrimp, most of the biomass now is in that deep water area. So you need a boat to go out into the lake. You need expensive gear and downriggers to target those lake trout down in the bottom. So it's changed the nature of fishing because most of the biomass is now concentrated in the deep, dark bottom. Lake whitefish are an interesting species because anglers are having a harder time finding them than they used to. But their numbers haven't changed. So perhaps their behavior has changed, or the timing of their migration or locations have changed. But I've had a number of anglers reach out and say, where are all the whitefish? They're gone. Well, all of the censusing numbers show that there's still 2.5 million of them. It's just really hard to find where they are. They're not always at the same place at the same time that they used to be. Food web changes, water temperature changes, timing and runoff, prey changes. I heard one theory that the yellow perch fry were down for a few years, and that's something that the lake whitefish would target in some of the shallow areas near Polson. I don't really know the answer to that. I've just heard a lot of angler speculation.
It looks like we may have lost Jeff Badnock. Looks like his screen was frozen. Tom, do you think we're nearing the end here because we're pushing the 8:30 mark?
We are. I'm taking a quick look in the chat to see if there are some questions that we didn't hit on. One comment is CSKT provides outstanding videos and brochures explaining how to catch lake trout. It would be great if similar information could be provided about fishing for lake trout or lake whitefish. Yeah, and lake whitefish are a little bit tougher to track down, and they aren't in the locations people were hoping. But I called this one up because CSKT and that Native Fish Keepers, they provide a whole bunch of different great recipes for lake trout. And they also do catch some lake whitefish as bycatch in their netting. So the tribes are definitely trying to get information out there to people to help them catch the targeted non-native species and to provide good recipes to enjoy them once you have caught them. So as I mentioned, people are the largest predator on this planet, and we've depleted a lot of species around the globe. So if we just put our attention on the ones that are less desirable, we could do some good. I was watching a show recently about lionfish. Lionfish is an invasive tropical fish that came from the Indian Ocean and is taking over the Caribbean. Well, there's all these fancy chefs in the Caribbean and in Florida who are coming up with these delicious recipes for lionfish to create a market, to create an economic market that does ecological good. And let me take one more here. How do you measure success against the continued threat of invasive species, and are we winning? That's a great question. It's very easy to measure losses when new species arrive to in the case of aquatics, to a new water body. So, the fact that Montana has not had the mussels spreading widely is success. It's, the absence of a detection is success. We are out with partners monitoring Flathead Lake 3 to 4 times a year. We've got 30 sites around Flathead Lake looking for the mussels. Every time we bring those samples in and don't get a detection, that's a success. It's not as flashy as other successes, but not getting the mussels every day, every year, we're not getting the mussels. That is a success. Are we winning? Well, we're not losing right now, right? The two positive detections in Montana in Tiber Reservoir and Canyon Ferry both happened in 2016. And in Canyon Ferry, there was just one sample that had a mussel detection. And so Canyon Ferry was put on kind of a watch list. There's a protocol amongst Western states on how to treat different water bodies with different levels of detection. And so Canyon Ferry was put on the suspect water body list. And to get off the suspect water body list, you need 3 years of no detections to go back to normal. And so between 2016 and 2019, or no positive detections for mussels were found. And so Canyon Ferry is off that list. Tiber Reservoir had multiple detections from multiple locations around that water body. And again, the state partners, the biostation's been out there helping. We have not had a repeat detection on Tiber since then. So Tiber was designated a mussel water body, and to get off of that list, you need 5 years of no detections. And we just had year 5 of no detection. So this is good. Sometimes when you get a positive detection, that population hasn't taken, right? They haven't established themselves, they haven't reproduced. Unfortunately, sometimes you get a positive detection for these mussels and you don't see anything for 5, 6, 7 years, and then all of a sudden they're everywhere. We're hoping that's not the case, but following the Western Regional Panel's protocol, both Tiber and Canyon Ferry are off of the mussel lists, because even though we got those detections in 2016, we haven't seen them since. So that's great news, and that, that's an indication of us not losing.
Excuse me, I got bumped off a couple of times, but I'm back. I wanted to ask also, a listener viewer had a question about cooperation from Georgetown Lake. Do you have any work going on up there with respect to invasive species?
At the biostation, we have not worked on Georgetown Lake, but I do know there's some aquatic researchers who have done some work on Georgetown Lake. Georgetown Lake is interesting because it's such high elevation that it can freeze almost all the way to the bottom, in some places all the way to the bottom. And that makes it hard for the fish to survive. I know Georgetown Lake also has a vegetation growth problem. But no, I've not personally worked in Georgetown Lake. I just have enjoyed it recreationally.
Well, we're getting towards the end of our allotted time, but I had a 2-point question. One, what are the opportunities for university students to interact with the Flathead Lake Biostation, either in their discipline or interdisciplinary work? And second of all, if a person wanted to drop by the biostation, do you have a way to engage with visitors? Or is that something that you're a scientific facility and you're not a visitor center?
Yeah, great questions. Yes, we engage university students from MSU and beyond all the time. They just need to reach out with questions or ideas for research topics. That'd be kind of informal engagement, and you can find descriptions of the research we do and the people at the station on our website with email addresses. But then summertime is when we engage most of the university students with our classes and our paid interdisciplinary internships. So if anyone has an idea or question, just feel free to reach out. You can certainly reach out to me, and I can farm the question to the appropriate person from there. But we are a education facility, and university students wanting to do research and learn are a target audience for us. And we do enjoy visits from the public. I have to say things have changed a little bit since COVID. We actually have a gate that we've kept down during COVID, but we look forward to opening that gate again. For someone who's really interested in checking out the station, again, I just suggest, reach out. We do tours all the time. People come and just walk around on their own. But these days with COVID, we do have the gate down. And part of that's because of the Yellow Bay State Park is right next door. And actually it's on our property. And when the gate is up, a lot of people show up at the biostation thinking we're the park, or the park is totally crowded and they look across the fence and they see that we've got all these open shoreline and beaches that they'd like to recreate on. So just the gate has helped us with the dramatic influx in the recreational public. Last summer, our gate was broken for a few days and our caretaker went to his house and he found a family from South Carolina having a picnic on his deck. And he engaged them and they're like, well, you know, the park was full and this looked nice here. So, you know, we welcome anyone who's interested in learning about the station and the science, and, you know, in the gate COVID era, just reach out to us and we're happy to coordinate a visit.
Outstanding. Tom, this was a wonderful presentation. I learned so much tonight, very interesting information. Flathead Lake, like for a lot of people, including myself, is one of my favorite places on earth. And I'm glad that you are doing your work there and looking out for its health. Invite the listeners to tune in next week at 7 o'clock on Tuesday evening for the next in our series of lectures on Our Environment Matters, the Alumni Association Community Lecture Series. So thank you very much. And Tom, if you'll just hang out after the session closes, we'll do a little debriefing. Thanks, everybody.
And we're going to wait to stop the webinar until Facebook catches up. Oop, here we go.